The Bible tells us how Jesus was born and how he changed the world. But nearly 18 years of his life seemed to disappear without a trace. After one remarkable story from his childhood, the gospel record suddenly goes silent until Jesus appears again around the age of 30. No detailed stories, no dramatic events, almost nothing. So where was Jesus during those missing years? And why would the gospel writers leave out such a large part of his life? For centuries, people have tried to fill that silence with stories of secret journeys, hidden wisdom, and lost teachings. But the evidence points to a very different answer, one that may reveal more about Jesus than any legend ever could. What if one of history's greatest mysteries exists because the people closest to the story never thought it was a mystery at all? Most biographies follow a familiar pattern. They tell us about childhood. They tell us about adolescence. They tell us about adulthood. And they usually explain how one stage of life leads to the next. The Gospels do something very different. They tell us about Jesus' miraculous birth. They describe his ministry. They record his death and resurrection. Yet between those events sits a gap so large that readers have been puzzled by it for centuries. Nearly 18 years. Think about that for a moment. Imagine reading the life story of a famous leader and discovering that everything between childhood and adulthood had been removed. No stories, no explanations, no details. Most people would immediately begin asking questions. Where was he? What was he doing? What experiences shaped him? Those are the same questions readers have asked about Jesus for nearly 2,000 years. And the longer those questions remained unanswered, the more fascinating the mystery became. People naturally dislike empty spaces in a story. When information is missing, the human mind tries to fill the gap, sometimes with facts, sometimes with assumptions, and sometimes with legends. That is exactly what happened with the missing years of Jesus. Over the centuries, theories began appearing everywhere. Some claimed he traveled across distant lands. Others suggested he learned secret wisdom from hidden teachers. Still others believed ancient records had been lost or deliberately hidden. The mystery continued to grow. But before exploring those theories, there is one clue many people overlook: the final story the Bible tells before the silence begins. Because hidden inside that story may be the key to understanding everything that followed. And what happened in Jerusalem when Jesus was 12 years old would leave even the religious teachers amazed. The final recorded story of Jesus before the missing years begins with a family celebration and ends with a frantic search. According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was 12 years old when his family traveled to Jerusalem for Passover. This was not a small event. Passover was one of the most important religious festivals of the year. Thousands of pilgrims traveled from towns and villages across the region. The roads would have been crowded. Families often traveled together in large groups. Children moved between relatives and friends. For a young boy from Nazareth, Jerusalem would have felt enormous. The city was larger, busier, more crowded. At its center stood the temple, the most important religious site in the Jewish world. For many visitors, seeing it was unforgettable. After the festival ended, families began the journey home. Mary and Joseph assumed Jesus was somewhere among relatives traveling with them. That would not have been unusual. But as the day continued, a terrible realization began to form. Jesus was nowhere to be found. Imagine the panic. Every parent knows that feeling. One moment, everything seems normal. The next moment, fear takes over. Questions begin racing through the mind. Where is he? When was the last time anyone saw him? Is he safe? Mary and Joseph immediately returned to Jerusalem. For 3 days they searched. 3 days. The city was crowded. Visitors were leaving. The streets were busy. Finding one 12-year-old boy would have seemed nearly impossible. Then they found him, not frightened, not lost, but sitting among respected religious teachers in the temple, listening, asking questions, taking part in discussions. According to Luke, everyone who heard him was amazed. Even at 12 years old, something about Jesus stood out. Then something surprising happens. The story ends. No teenage years follow. No stories about young adulthood. The gospel simply moves on. And that silence would eventually create one of the biggest mysteries in religious history. What happened next? Whenever history leaves behind a blank space, people rush to fill it. That pattern appears again and again throughout history. When records disappear, legends often take their place. The less information people have, the more imagination begins to work. And few historical figures have inspired more curiosity than Jesus. Think about it. The Bible records his birth, his miracles, his teachings, his death and resurrection. Yet nearly 18 years remain almost completely unspoken. For many people, that silence feels impossible. Surely something important must have happened. Surely there must be stories waiting to be discovered. As centuries passed, those assumptions created new theories. Stories spread from region to region. Some claimed Jesus studied in Egypt. Others claimed he spent years among secret religious groups. A few suggested hidden books existed that revealed the truth. Many of these stories appeared generations after Jesus lived. Some appeared hundreds of years later. That timing matters. The farther a source is from an event, the more difficult it becomes to verify. Historians look for evidence close to the time something happened. The closer the source, the stronger the evidence usually becomes. But many stories about Jesus' missing years appeared long after the people who knew him were gone. That did not stop the stories from spreading. In fact, the mystery itself made them more attractive. People often expect extraordinary answers. An ordinary explanation can feel disappointing. A secret journey sounds more exciting than a young man working in a small village. Yet history often surprises us. The most exciting explanation is not always the most likely one. And one particular theory would become more famous than all the others. According to this story, Jesus didn't spend his missing years in Galilee. He spent them thousands of miles away in India. This is where the mystery transforms into something that sounds almost like an adventure story. In 1894, a Russian traveler named Nicholas Notovich published a remarkable claim. According to his account, he had traveled through the Himalayas and visited a monastery. While staying there, he claimed monks showed him ancient writings about a holy man named Isa. Notovich believed Isa was Jesus. According to his story, these writings described Jesus traveling through India during his missing years. There, he supposedly learned from religious teachers before eventually returning home. The story spread quickly. Books were written. Newspapers discussed it. People who had always wondered about the missing years suddenly believed they had found the answer. It seemed to explain everything. But historians wanted proof. Claims require evidence, especially extraordinary claims. Researchers began investigating. Some traveled to the monastery themselves. Others interviewed monks. Many searched for the manuscripts that supposedly contained the story. Almost immediately, problems appeared. The manuscripts could not be produced. Independent researchers struggled to verify the account. Reports from the monastery contradicted important parts of the story. As scholars looked deeper, confidence in the claim began to collapse. That does not mean the theory disappeared. Even today, versions of it continue to circulate. The idea remains fascinating because it offers a dramatic solution to a famous mystery. But historians must follow evidence rather than excitement, and the evidence simply does not support the claim. Yet one question remained. If Jesus probably did not travel across India, If he probably did not study with distant teachers, then where was he? The answer may have been sitting only a few miles from Nazareth all along. What if the strongest clue about Jesus' missing years wasn't hidden in a distant monastery, but just a few miles from his hometown? Many people imagine Nazareth as a bustling town. In reality, it was probably a small village with only a few hundred residents. Life there would have been simple. Families knew one another. News traveled quickly. Most people spent their days working, raising children, and supporting their community. But only a short distance away stood a very different place, a city called Sepphoris. During Jesus' youth, Sepphoris was growing rapidly. Construction projects were underway. Buildings were rising, roads were being expanded, workers were needed everywhere. This becomes especially interesting when we remember how Jesus is described later in life. The Greek word, often translated as carpenter, can also mean builder or craftsman. In a region where stone construction was common, that work likely involved far more than woodworking. Many historians believe Jesus may have spent years learning and practicing a trade in the area. If so, he would have encountered people from every walk of life: farmers, laborers, merchants, landowners, the poor and the wealthy. And when we later read Jesus' teachings, those experiences seem to echo throughout them. He spoke about builders laying foundations, farmers planting seed, workers earning wages, debtors struggling with money, landowners managing property. His examples feel less like abstract lessons and more like observations from everyday life. The more closely historians examine his teachings, the more they resemble the world surrounding Nazareth and Sepphoris. And that raises an important possibility. What if the missing years weren't empty at all? What if they were years of preparation? What if the real story behind the missing years is not about adventure, but preparation? When people hear the phrase missing years, they often imagine something dramatic: secret journeys, lost manuscripts, hidden teachings. But historians often arrive at a much simpler conclusion. Many believe Jesus spent those years living a largely ordinary life, working, learning, studying scripture, participating in his community, growing into adulthood. At first, that answer may sound disappointing, but ordinary does not mean unimportant. In fact, those years may have shaped everything that came later. Consider the teachings Jesus would eventually share. They reveal a deep understanding of human nature. He spoke about anxiety, forgiveness, generosity, pride, humility, family conflict, and financial struggles. Again and again, his examples reflected the lives of ordinary people, the concerns of workers, the challenges of families, the hopes of those trying to make a living. There is another clue as well. After Jesus' childhood, Joseph largely disappears from the gospel record. No explanation is given. Many scholars believe Joseph may have died before Jesus began his public ministry. If that happened, additional responsibilities may have fallen on Jesus, helping support the family, providing stability, taking on adult responsibilities long before his ministry began. Those experiences would have required patience, discipline, and maturity. And perhaps that is the most overlooked possibility of all. The years before Jesus became known may have been years of quiet preparation, years spent learning lessons that cannot be taught in a classroom, lessons learned through responsibility, work, family, and daily life. But if those years were so important, why did the gospel writers say almost nothing about them? The answer may be much simpler than most people expect. Modern readers often approach the Gospels like biographies, and in some ways they are. But they are not biographies in the modern sense. Today, biographers often try to record every stage of a person's life. Ancient writers had different priorities. Their goal was not necessarily to document every year. Their goal was to explain why a person mattered. The Gospel writers focused on what they believed was most important: Jesus' teachings, his miracles, his death, his resurrection. Those events formed the heart of their message. From their perspective, years of ordinary work and daily life may not have required detailed coverage. That does not mean they were hiding information. It does not mean a secret existed. It simply means they were telling a different kind of story. Once that is understood, the silence begins to look less mysterious. Instead of a cover-up, it looks intentional. Instead of missing information, it looks like selective storytelling. And once you see it that way, the entire mystery starts to look very different. After centuries of theories, secret journeys, and hidden teaching legends, one question remains. What does the evidence actually say? The mystery of Jesus' missing years has fascinated people for nearly 2,000 years, and in many ways, that fascination is understandable. People are naturally drawn to mysteries. We want hidden answers. We want dramatic discoveries. We want explanations nobody else knows. That desire has fueled countless books, documentaries, and theories. But when historians step back and examine the evidence, a very different picture emerges. Again and again, the strongest evidence points back to Galilee. Not India, not Tibet, not a distant monastery hidden in the mountains. Galilee, the region where Jesus grew up, the region where his family lived, the region where his ministry would later begin. And while that answer may sound less exciting than the legends, it carries an important lesson. History is often shaped by ordinary moments, long before extraordinary moments become visible. When Jesus began his public ministry around the age of 30, people were amazed by his wisdom. But wisdom rarely appears overnight. It develops over years, experience after experience, responsibility after responsibility, conversation after conversation. If Jesus spent nearly 2 decades working, learning, studying, and helping support a family, those years were not empty. They were formative. They were preparing him. And perhaps that is what makes the missing years so fascinating. Not because they contain a hidden secret, but because they remind us that preparation is often invisible. History notices the public moment, the breakthrough, the achievement, the success. What history often misses are the years that came before, the years nobody applauded, the years nobody recorded, the years when the future remained unseen. Maybe that is why the gospel writers said so little. Long before the crowds arrived, long before the miracles, long before history began paying attention, a young man in Galilee was quietly preparing for something nobody else could yet see. And perhaps the greatest mystery of Jesus' missing years is not that they were hidden. It's that the most important part of them may have looked completely ordinary.